Next, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, and that is Dr. Vic Sandler. Many of you know Dr. Sandler, but for those who do not, he is kind and warm and compassionate. He's the kind of doctor you wish everybody could have, especially when people are facing end-of-life issues. He is the medical director of Fairview Home Care, the associate medical director of Fairview Hospice, and he is the president of the Minnesota Network of Hospice and Palliative Medicine Physicians. His medical expertise and his own personal journey make him uniquely qualified to be with all of us this morning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vic Sandler.
I'm waiting for my dad to show up. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I've been looking forward to this day since I was invited to talk to all of you to tell the story of my dad, Mike Sandler. This gathering is focused on caregiving for loved ones with dementia. My dad died of Alzheimer's disease in 2007. What makes my story unique is that when my dad was diagnosed with dementia in 2001, I'd been practicing geriatric medicine for almost 20 years. I had cared for hundreds of patients with dementia. The changes that I were to see in my father, as his brain deteriorated from the ravages of this disease, were not new to me. My skills as a geriatrician did help me navigate the changes in my father as his memory declined and at times very troublesome behaviors emerged. But my knowledge as a geriatrician could only help so much in my caregiving. My love for my dad was so much more important. As a son, I was not able to use medical skills to navigate the troubled waters of my father's disease. I, like all of you in the audience, grieved each loss. Love is the most important ingredient in caregiving, as all of you probably know. So this morning you will hear nothing from this geriatrician about research to cure Alzheimer's or drugs used to treat the disease, because that is not relevant to caregivers. What you will hear is the story of Mike Sandler, the man that he was, a wonderful man and father, a man that taught me by his example about how a man is supposed to laugh and cry, love and share, and care for his family, his friends, and his community. And then you will hear about Mike Sandler after he developed dementia, and how my love for him allowed me to continue a meaningful, fulfilling relationship. My mom and dad got married late in life in their generation. My mom was 31 and my dad was 33. My dad first saw my mom at Yom Kippur services in Des Moines, Iowa in 1948. He was enamored by this beautiful redhead from the moment he saw her. They didn't waste any time. They were married a few months later in December and had their first child, my older brother Mark, in August 1949. They followed God's commandment to be fruitful and multiply, and proceeded to have 4 boys within the next 4.5 years. Now, if you look around this room, you'll realize that it was a mistake to have 4 boys, because the substantial majority of caregivers are wives, daughters, and daughters-in-law. So if you need a caregiver, you best have a daughter or a devoted daughter-in-law. But my parents lucked out, not because they had eventually 4 daughters-in-law, but because Victor, their second son, and that would be me, as my wife Annette would say, was the best daughter they could have ever hoped for. Mike Sandler was quite a piece of work. Lover of life, lover of his wife and 4 boys, storyteller, golfer, salesman, business executive, World War II sailor, singer, and underlying all of this, a very proud Jew. He loved his heritage, his people, and his Yiddishkeit. When I was a child, my dad would load his 4 boys into our 1956 Chevy station wagon, a Woody, and drive us up to North Minneapolis to Bubby's, my grandmother. She was a wonderful and loving woman who spoke Yinglish, a combination of English and Yiddish. We didn't understand her words, but we understood her love for us. For example, her word for the Minneapolis Aquatennial was the Katunyak. My father would joke with her about her language skills, and she would laugh, and Dad would laugh, and we all would laugh. But more importantly, we understood the beauty of the love that a father had for his mother. So Dad taught us compassion because Boogie was a very frail woman. He taught us respect because Dad understood the great accomplishment of this woman's life. A woman who immigrated from Russia as a teenager, child in tow, and raised 7 children and taught them Jewish values and taught them kindness and taught them finally love. The beauty of a son's love for his mother, he taught us that too. As I mentioned, my dad was an amazing storyteller. So from Bubby's, we would drive to Antilles, and after dinner, my 3 brothers and I, and my cousins Stan and Larry and Debbie would gather around my father's chair, and he would tell us his version of Henny Penny, Cocky Locky, and the Sky is Falling story. Every week the story changed, and every week we loved it. We loved him. The night before my dad's funeral, I learned from my nieces and nephews, my father's grandchildren, that they too had been told the Henny Penny story. So I made the promise at my father's funeral that if my fathers bless us with grandchildren, if my daughters bless us with grandchildren, and we hope they will, I will tell my grandchildren the Henny Penny story also. Let me tell you a story from those early years of my life that speaks volume about who my dad was as a man and as a father. When I was 8 years old, believe it or not, I had misbehaved. Something this little boy rarely did, at least in my own mind. My parents decided to punish my misbehavior by taking away my baseball card collection, something that I cherished. For me at 8 years old, that was an intolerable punishment. So I decided to get even. Late in the afternoon, I hid in the closet. Dinner time came, my mom and dad called for their sons to come, but I wasn't coming. I was mad. 1 hour passed, 2 hours passed. I'm sure my parents were becoming frantic. The neighbors were called, the police were called. I heard all the commotion, but I wasn't coming out because I was so mad, getting a little hungry. Then the policeman shined his flashlight into the back of the closet. Behind the overcoats where I was crouched down, he saw my skinny little legs. I was busted. He drew me out of the closet and led me to my father, who was sitting at the breakfast room table. Now, I knew that he couldn't take my baseball cards away again, but I thought at a minimum I was due a potch on the tush. My dad put a hand on each of my little arms, drew me to him, hugged me, and he sobbed. Because in those few hours that I was gone and my safety was in doubt, I'm sure my father was shaken to his core. And in his core there was only love. And so he sobbed tears of relief and joy because his son was safe. My dad taught us through the power of his example. He hugged and kissed his 4 boys when we were children. He hugged and kissed his 4 boys as we became men. We learned that is what men do who love their sons or their brothers or their friends. In 1980, I moved back to Minnesota from Massachusetts after I completed my medical residency. I came back here because Minnesota was my home and my parents' home. I knew that one day they would need me to care for them in their later years. And as my parents cared for me, raised me, and loved me, so I would care for them as they someday would grow old and die. There was never any question in my mind that my deep love for my parents would lead me to care for and comfort them during their years of declining health. My mother was diagnosed with metastatic lung cancer in 1998. I thought she would live only a few months. She lived almost 3 years. Because of the stroke and the spread of the cancer to her brain, she became progressively more debilitated during those years and totally bedridden for the last year. My mother, in fact, had advanced dementia when she died. Not from Alzheimer's disease, but from the multiple insults to her brain. She very likely had vascular dementia due to a stroke, radiation damage to her brain, and from both benign and malignant brain tumors that she had suffered from as well. My father got very ill during the time that my mother was dying and required emergency heart surgery. He was 84. I think the surgery took a lot out of him, but he made a really good recovery over time. I was the principal caregiver for both of my parents for almost 10 years. I have 3 brothers, but they all lived out of town. Thank God for my wife and my cousin Elise and Marlene and Aaron, 2 wonderful women who helped care for my mom. During those 10 years, I understood what it meant to be in the sandwich generation. I understood I had a family of my own with 2 teenage daughters. It was often very hard for me to miss time with my own family so that I could care for my parents. It helped a lot that my daughters were in very capable hands. Thank you, Annette. But they did not always relieve the burden. That did not always relieve the burden of guilt. Missing school events and family dinners were hard for me. But I was in charge of my parents' well-being. I had designated myself to fill that role. I would not and could not have it any other way. My mother died in 2001. We all grieved her loss. But because we were so absorbed in caring for my mother, we didn't notice that my dad had been changing. But it became very apparent the week after my mother's funeral when my father and I were due to drive my younger brother to the airport for his return trip to Israel. I left work and went to my parents' home 2 hours before we were scheduled to take my brother back to the airport so that I could spend some time with my brother and my dad. My brother was home, but my dad was not. I was surprised. This was so unusual for my father. He was a very emotional man. Whenever my brother returned to Israel, his eyes would always fill with tears as he embraced him and said goodbye. The minutes and hours went by, and still my father did not come home. My brother and I became frantic. I called 911 to see if they had reports of a man named Vic Sandler in an accident. My brother canceled his flight. He would not leave without knowing what had happened to our father. 3 hours later, my father came home. I went to the door, very upset. I said, "Dad, where have you been? We were supposed to take Neil to the airport. He had to cancel his flight because we were so worried about you." My dad had kind of a sheepish grin on his face and said, "I was just out for lunch." We later found out that he was out for lunch with a lady friend. This episode, along with my realization that my dad's memory was declining, led me to decide to take my father to a neurologist. He was diagnosed with dementia, Alzheimer's disease, 1 month after my mother died. So the behavior that I had witnessed 1 month earlier when my father failed to return home to take my brother to the airport and lunch with a lady friend just a week after my mother died, this I refer to as Casanova's dementia. My father had always been a ladies' man. My mother had been his lady for 53 years, the love of his life. But with her death and loss of inhibition that is often part of dementia, my father was already in the hunt for female companionship. The loss of inhibition, which I as a geriatrician understood as part of the disease of dementia, was understandable and not disturbing to me. But for my youngest brother, Dan, who would drive up from Iowa every month or two, it was very disturbing. My father would also repeatedly accuse accused Dan of stealing his clothes. The irony was that both Dan and my younger brother Neil had commonly borrowed my dad's clothes without permission in earlier years, decades before my dad had dementia. That never seemed to bother my dad at the time, but dementia often distorts and dilutes the mind. People with dementia can become paranoid. They may believe that people are stealing their money, or in my dad's case, their clothes. A very common delusion is infidelity. They may believe that their spouse of 60 years has become unfaithful. It's often fruitless to attempt to dissuade them from their delusion. The best strategy is often distraction or changing the subject, though sometimes medications are necessary. The next year, though I had a family of my own, I went from work to my parents' home to make dinner for my dad and spend time together every night. During that year, he had a stroke that caused blindness in an eye. Every morning, despite his mild dementia and the blindness in the eye, he would drive to the synagogue for the morning minion service. I became very concerned about his safety, and I told him, "Dad, I want you to get a driving test to make sure you're safe." My dad trusted me, and so he agreed. My wife and I took him to the Courage Center to have a comprehensive driving evaluation. This is a driving evaluation done by occupational therapists that examines cognition, vision, hearing, and does a behind-the-wheel test as well. I was absolutely certain he would flunk the test. He passed. So he continued to drive to morning services until a month or two later, when he got lost driving home. I said, "Dad, it's time to stop driving." And because he loved me and trusted me, he said, "Okay." But my dad was isolated at home from that point on. Annette and I talked, and we decided it would be best if we moved my dad into assisted living. We believed it would be better for his social life, his safety, and his health. Moving my dad also relieved some of my stress and worry about my dad being alone all day long while I was at work. My dad had lived in our family home for nearly 50 years. I was very worried that the move from a 9-room home in South Minneapolis to a small 2-room apartment would be depressing if not devastating to him. But he agreed to the move, again, because he trusted me. So on the days before the move, away from my dad, we moved some of his favorite furniture and art and family pictures to his new apartment. On the day of the move, Annette and I drove my dad to his new home. I was still very worried. My dad walked in through the new front door, his eyes widened, and he said, "This is great." And with his big happy smile and his big hearty laugh, he embraced me and thanked me. Over the next 5 years, we moved my dad 3 more times. From the assisted living to the memory care unit within the same assisted living, from that memory care unit to a new dementia assisted living, and finally within that dementia assisted living to a unit for residents with advanced dementia. Every time we moved my dad, I had a great deal of trepidation that it would be very hard for him. I thought he would react adversely to this new, smaller, more restrictive environment. But he never did. I think in retrospect, each move was much harder on me than my dad. He walked into each new space with his mind only in the present, happy to see a familiar chair or pictures of his family. I, on the other hand, looked into the past, at what my dad had lost, and into the future, knowing that each move was another sign of his continued decline. So for me, the moves were all hard, but for my dad, they were surprisingly easy. I spent weeks worrying about how each move would affect my dad. The anticipation and anxiety that I felt for these weeks was very difficult. I would never tell my dad about the move until the day before. And every time, he thanked me. Though as his disease progressed, his language failed him. But as he entered each new living space, the son he trusted was at his side. The bond of love between us never failed. And I know gave him the peace of mind to more comfortably pass through these transitions. I know from my work that these transitions, moving from one place to another, often do not go so well. They can be very upsetting to both the person with dementia and to their family. We were so fortunate that this was not one of our challenges. One evening, Annette and I went to visit my dad at the memory care unit. When we sat down at the table with him, he saw us and was so thrilled that we were able to find him. Because he had heard a lot of construction sounds during the day, and he got it in his mind that he was traveling on a train, something he hadn't done in over 50 years. Somehow he didn't know how Annette and I were able to find the train he was on. He was so excited, laughing and giggling that we could take the train ride with him. During the Depression, when my dad didn't have two nickels to rub together, he actually used to ride the rails by jumping into boxcars and going cross country. He was once arrested in upstate New York, trying to make his way from Minneapolis to New York City to join his older brother and to try and find a job. So undoubtedly, he had some amazing memories of riding rails. But for Annette and I, we were just happy to see him with his big smile on his face and happy to travel with him on his train trip. This very pleasant experience of traveling with my dad on an imaginary train is a good example of how we as caregivers need to meet our loved ones with dementia in their reality, rather than try to bend their minds back to our reality. So as long as they're safe, travel with them. My dad was a loving and emotional man. He served his country in World War II as a Navy Chief Petty Officer on an aircraft carrier, the USS Ranger. But he was never a violent man. He rarely talked about the war. He did not like films that depicted violence. So I was very surprised when I got a call from the memory care unit that I needed to get there right away because my father had thrown a chair through the window. I rushed down to the facility. It was 3:30 in the morning. Walked into my dad's room to find a large window, totally shattered, glass all over the room. My dad had had a delusion. He was not a violent man. He was a frightened man. The facility would not let my father stay there any longer. So I had to drive him down to Fairview, the hospital where I worked, and brought him to the emergency room. He was admitted to the Locke Geriatric Psychiatry Unit. Over the next week, I assumed my father would be allowed to return to the memory care unit after it was established that though he wasn't Gandhi, he was not a violent man. But they decided that he could not come back. So I scrambled to find another residence for my dad. I was able to find a specialized dementia assisted living residence about 20 minutes from our home. I visited my dad there 3 or 4 times a week. Whenever I would travel up there, I would say to our black lab, Zoe, let's go see Saba. That's the Hebrew word for grandpa that my daughters called my dad. Zoe would rush to the garage door. She knew that visiting Saba meant she got to explore the unit he lived on. And the floor of dementia units often have lots of odors and food scraps. Zoe was like going to a doggy amusement park. Now you may think that bringing Zoe to my dad was what we call pet therapy, which can be very, very positive for elderly people both with and without dementia. But to be honest, my dad was never a dog person. Bringing Zoe, it was more for Zoe and me than for my dad. I brought my dad to our house as often as I could for Shabbat dinner and for Jewish holidays. I probably did this more for me than for my dad. I knew as a geriatrician that the horizons of people with dementia progressively shrink. They become increasingly uncomfortable going into new places. Those new places may in fact be places that had been very much part of their past lives before dementia, but because of their memory loss, they were no longer recognizable. But I wanted to have my dad participate in the life he always had cherished. I remember very clearly the last time I brought my dad to our house. It was for a Shabbat dinner. From the moment I picked him up for the drive back to our home, he seemed very unsettled. When we got to the house, even before the Shabbat blessings, he said he didn't feel well and he wanted to lie down. He lied down on our couch and stayed there throughout dinner. He wasn't interested in getting up until I suggested that I drive him back to the home that he knew. This I knew was the shrinking world of a man with progressive dementia. My dad was no longer comfortable leaving his room and the spaces around it at his residence. The experience of driving to our home and eating what had become a new and strange environment was overwhelming for him. All of you know, often the earliest sign of dementia is memory loss. One of the most troubling features of that memory loss is when your loved one loses a memory that is very important to you, and you think to them as well. One day when Annette and I were visiting my dad at the assisted living, he asked me where my mother was. I said, "Dad, Mom died." And he got very upset and said, "Why didn't you bring me to the funeral?" And I said, "Dad, we did bring you to the funeral." The experience was very unsettling for me and for my dad. A couple of days later, my dad asked again, "Where's your mom?" This time we said, "She couldn't come today." We changed the subject and we all were content. This is one of the hardest things to learn that both I and my wife teach when we are trying to guide dementia caregivers. It is always better to tell little white lies or change the subject rather than continue on a topic that would be discomforting for both you and them. My wife Annette calls this therapeutic fibbing when she teaches people how best to interact with people suffering from dementia. As many of you are aware, dementia for most people afflicted with the disease leads to progressive loss of speech. The medical term for this is aphasia. This was true for my dad. But he continued to sing, and in an attempt to communicate, he made up his own language. My dad was a joke teller and a storyteller, so he needed to have some words. The staff at the assisted living had heard that my father spoke Yiddish, and they asked if these new words were Yiddish, but they were definitely not Yiddish. His favorite expression was "hasta la borda, tu, tu, tu." To me it sounded Italian, but my dad never spoke Italian. Once when I asked him what he meant, he said, "I don't have a clue." When I would try to be sociable and use similar sounding words to converse with my dad, he would laugh because he knew I wasn't making any sense. My dad's dementia continued to progress, but I am sure he knew me, though he had not called me by my name for a long time. He always had this sparkle in his eye whenever he saw me walk in. His face would light up. That is, until his 92nd birthday. That day, Annette and I and my father's two surviving siblings, my Aunt Tilly and my Uncle Hyde, drove up to see my dad and celebrate his birthday. We brought a birthday cake, we would sing him happy birthday, and share cake. My dad was lying down on the couch asleep in the main lounge of the unit when we arrived. I tried to arouse him. He slowly opened his eyes with a vacant stare. He seemed to look right through me, and for the first time, he did not recognize me. I said, "Dad, we're here for your birthday." No response. He closed his eyes and went back to sleep. That was October 21st, 2007. For the next 2 weeks, I continued to visit my dad, and he did not recognize me any longer. He was often lethargic, he was eating very poorly, and losing weight. At 3 a.m. the morning of November 7th, 2.5 weeks after my father's 92nd birthday, I got a call from the night nurse at the residence. She said, "Vic, your dad has changed." She told me that he was feverish and congested and didn't respond. My love for my father lifted me from the bed. My intuition as a doctor, but more as a son, who deeply loved his father, was that I must be with him. Annette said to me as I wrote it, "Do you want me to go with you?" And I said, "No, I want you to sleep." So I drove through the night, and I was not alone, because I knew this: though I was walking in the valley of the shadow of death, I feared no harm, for God was with me. And as tears streamed down my cheeks, my heart was filled with gratitude to God for the gift of my father's life. As I sat down beside my father, I held his hand and kissed his brow. I said the Shema, the prayer my father taught me as a child, as a bedtime prayer before I understood its meaning. But now I understood. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Because in the deep love I have for my Father, and the joy that I felt for the bond of the love that lived between us, I had found the oneness of God. So as I held my father's hand, I kissed his forehead 5 times, once for each of his 4 sons, once for my mother. As my father took his final breaths, my heart was full, because I was not alone. So to all of you who are in the midst of caregiving, I understand. I understand the stress and the anxiety you are living through. I honor your courage for being here today to seek better understanding and tools to better deal with the daily stresses of caregiving. But my hope for you and my prayer for each of you is that as you care for your loved ones with dementia, your love will empower you on that often challenging journey, so that when your loved one takes his or her final breaths, you will feel gratified that your love for them enabled you to provide for them, and that as time passes, that what will survive will be that love and the lifetime of experiences from where that love originated. I believe and hope that that will give you peace. And so it was, from my boogie to her son, my dad, and from my dad to me and back again. From generation to generation, or door by door, the love was transmitted. And as I go forward in this life, I take my Father with me. He dwells in my heart. I will always be grateful for the blessings I received from my Father throughout his life. For these are the blessings of God. As our liturgy speaks, his soul will be bound up in the bond of my life, and I thank God for the gift of my Father's life. Thank you.